The sun was barely up, casting a soft orange glow over the quiet streets of Maplewood Estates, a tidy suburban neighborhood in Ohio where every lawn was clipped to perfection and mailboxes stood like sentinels in uniform rows. I was in my garage, hands greasy from wrestling with the chain on my son's bike. 8-year-old Tommy had been begging me to fix it for days, and I'd finally carved out a Saturday morning to get it done. The air smelled of motor oil and fresh-cut grass, the kind of morning that felt like it could stay peaceful forever. Then I heard a low, guttural rumble, not the usual buzz of a neighbor's lawnmower or the hum of a delivery truck. This was heavier, meaner, like the earth itself was growling. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped onto the driveway, squinting toward the backyard. My stomach dropped. A bulldozer, its yellow bulk gleaming under the morning light, was churning through my grass, its blade aimed straight for the playground I'd built for Tommy last summer. The wooden swing set, the slide he loved, the sandbox where he'd spent hours building castles they were being crushed like kindling. Splinters flew, metal groaned, and the earth churned into a muddy mess. I sprinted around the house, nearly tripping over a garden hose, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing near the wreckage, arms crossed and chin tilted like she owned the place, was Margaret Hensley, president of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. Her crisp blazer and tight bun gave her the look of someone who thrived on control, the kind of person who'd fine you for a slightly faded mailbox flag. I'd had run-ins with her before, petty notes about my holiday lights or the height of my grass, but this was something else entirely. "Margaret," I shouted, storming toward her, my voice sharp enough to cut through the bulldozer's roar. "What the hell is going on? That's my property." She didn't flinch. "Your playground was in violation of HOA regulations, David," she said, her tone as cold as the clipboard she clutched. "It disrupts the neighborhood's aesthetic standards and encroaches on setback lines. We sent you warnings." "Warnings?" I snapped. "You mean those vague notes slipped under my door with no dates or signatures? You had no right to touch my property." Margaret's lips pursed, like she'd just tasted something sour. "The board voted. The structure was deemed non-compliant. You had ample opportunity to address it." I glanced back at the wreckage. The slide was bent in half, the swings tangled in a heap. That playground wasn't just a structure, it was Tommy's birthday gift, built over 3 sweaty weekends with my own hands. I'd sanded every board until it was smooth, driven every nail with care, picturing his grin as he'd raced to the top. Now it was gone, reduced to tire tracks and broken dreams. Tommy was only 8, but he loved that playground like it was his own little kingdom. "You're going to pay for this," I said, my voice low, barely containing the fury bubbling inside me. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "The HOA acted within its authority, David. File a complaint if you feel the need." She turned and strode off, her heels clicking on the pavement as the bulldozer revved and backed out, leaving a trail of gouged earth behind. I stood there, fists clenched, staring at the ruin of my backyard. 2 promises burned in my mind. I'd make the HOA pay for every cent of damage, and if they refused, I'd hit them where it hurt most, their precious properties. I wasn't just fighting for a playground. I was fighting for my son, my home, and the right to live without someone's petty rules crushing everything I cared about. By the time the sun was fully up, I was at my kitchen table, laptop open, pulling up the county assessor's website. Property lines don't lie, and I needed hard proof. The parcel map loaded, clear as day. My backyard, my fence, my playground, all within the clean rectangle of land I'd bought and paid for. No easements, no encroachments, just my property, plain and simple. I printed the map, highlighting the boundaries in red, and moved to the next step. I'd installed security cameras around the house a year ago after the HOA misplaced my Christmas wreaths, another one of Margaret's power plays. Logging into the system, I found the footage from that morning. 10:47 a.m., the bulldozer rolling onto my lawn, Margaret waving it forward like a general directing troops. No hesitation, no attempt to knock on my door, just deliberate destruction. I clipped the video, timestamped it, and saved it to a cloud drive, then backed it up on an external hard drive for good measure. My next move was a call I hadn't made in years. I dialed the number for Clarkson and Reed, a law firm where I'd clerked a decade ago before switching to a quieter career in project management. Clarkson and Reed, came the receptionist's voice. "This is David Harper. I used to work under Ellen Clarkson. Is she still practicing?" A pause, then a few clicks. "Mr. Harper, hold one moment." Soon, Ellen's familiar voice came through, warm but sharp. like she was ready to dive into a fight. David Harper, as I live and breathe. What did those HOA vultures do this time? I laid it all out. The bulldozer, the playground, Margaret's smug dismissal. Ellen listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she let out a long sigh. They sent a bulldozer onto your private property without a court order or proper notice. That's criminal trespass, destruction of property, and possibly conspiracy if the board knowingly voted for it. This isn't small claims territory, David. We're talking civil litigation, maybe criminal charges. Do you still have your homeowner's insurance policy? Filed away, I said. Good. Submit a claim today. Force the HOA to respond in writing. I'll draft a cease and desist letter and a demand for damages. Keep every document, every photo, every scrap of evidence. And David, her voice dropped, don't settle. Make them regret this. By noon, I'd filed the insurance claim, uploaded the security footage to Ellen's firm, and printed another copy of the parcel map. My next stop was the sheriff's office. I walked in with a folder thick with evidence, photos of the wreckage, the footage on a USB drive, the assessor's map, and one of the HOA's so-called warning letters, which was little more than a typed note with no legal weight. Deputy Carl Thompson met me in the lobby, a stocky man in his late 40s with a handshake that could crush walnuts. "You're the guy with the bulldozer problem?" he asked, leading me to a small office. "Word travels fast. Your neighbor called it in, said it looked like a demolition crew tearing through a kid's playground." I handed him the folder. He flipped through it, his brow furrowing as he studied the photos and skimmed the footage on his computer. "This is clear-cut," he muttered. "Unlawful destruction of private property. We'll open a case. I'll need a formal statement. You good with that?" "More than good," I said. We spent the next hour going over every detail. When I'd built the playground, the HOA's vague warnings, Margaret's role in the destruction. Carl asked pointed questions, jotting notes with a pen that looked older than his badge. When we finished, he leaned back. "We'll need to talk to Ms. Hensley next. Any history of conflict with her? She finds people for breathing too loudly," I said. "Good luck getting her to admit she's wrong." That evening, I typed up a certified letter to the HOA detailing the damages, $18,500 for materials, labor, landscaping repair, and emotional distress for Tommy, who hadn't stopped asking why his playground was gone. I gave them 10 days to respond. They didn't. Instead, 2 days later, I found a white envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a pink notice fining me $750 for unauthorized backyard modifications and claiming I was delinquent on HOA dues with added penalties. It was a blatant attempt to intimidate me, and it only fueled my resolve. I called Ellen immediately. "They're trying to find me now," I said, reading her the notice. "They're doubling down." She laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "They're panicking. File the civil suit tomorrow. We're going for trespass, negligence, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." "And David? Let's start the lien process. They'll learn what happens when they pick a fight with someone who knows the law." By the next morning, Ellen had filed the lawsuit, naming Margaret and the HOA board as defendants. We also prepared preliminary notices of intent to place liens on the properties of 4 board members, including Margaret's pristine colonial with its manicured lawn and gaudy fountain. If they thought they could bully me into submission, they were about to face a reckoning. The next few days in Maplewood Estates felt like the calm before a storm. My backyard was still a mess of churned dirt and splintered wood, a constant reminder of the HOA's overreach. Tommy had stopped asking about his playground, but I caught him staring out the kitchen window, his small hands pressed against the glass. It broke my heart, but it also steeled my resolve. Margaret Hensley and her HOA cronies thought they could crush my son's joy and walk away unscathed. They were wrong. Ellen Clarkson, my lawyer, moved fast. By Monday, the civil lawsuit was officially filed in county court, charging the Maplewood Estates HOA with destruction of private property, trespass, negligence, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lien notices were sent to 4 board members, including Margaret, whose colonial mansion sat at the end of the cul-de-sac like a monument to her ego. Under Ohio law, HOAs could be held liable for gross misconduct, and in cases of deliberate harm, board members' personal assets weren't always untouchable. Ellen made sure the notices were airtight, filed with the county recorder's office, and delivered by certified mail. I pictured Margaret opening hers, her perfectly manicured nails trembling as she read the words, "intent to lien." I wasn't sitting idle either. Deputy Carl Thompson called me that same week with an update that sent a jolt through me. We tracked down the bulldozer operator, he said, his voice steady but edged with intrigue. Guy's name is Mike Russo. Runs a small excavation business out of Dayton. He gave a signed statement, notarized and witnessed. Says Margaret told him she had a court order to demolish your playground. He never saw it, just took her word. She lied to him? I asked, leaning forward in my office chair. Looks like it. He's cooperative, feels bad about the whole thing. Said he wouldn't have touched your yard if he'd known the truth. We're adding fraud to the list of charges we're building against her. Fraud. The word landed like a punch. This wasn't just about a playground anymore. It was about a pattern of deception. Carl promised to keep me posted and suggested I stop by the sheriff's office later to review new evidence. I agreed, but my mind was already racing. Margaret had orchestrated this like a dictator, and I was starting to wonder how deep her schemes ran. That evening, I drove to the HOA's clubhouse to drop off another copy of my damage invoice, just to keep the pressure on. The clubhouse was a squat brick building with overly polished windows and a signboard advertising community yoga and annual dues reminder. As I slid the envelope into the drop box, I noticed a group of neighbors gathered in the parking lot, their voices low but urgent. I recognized one of them, Frank Miller, a retired Air Force mechanic who lived 3 houses down. He waved me over. David, you got a minute? Frank's voice was gruff, his eyes scanning the lot like he was expecting trouble. We heard about the bulldozer. Whole neighborhood's talking. I nodded, cautious. Yeah, it's a mess. I'm handling it. You're doing more than handling it, said a woman next to him, Linda Carter, a librarian with gray streaks in her hair. You're fighting back. Nobody's done that before. Their words caught me off guard. I'd always thought of Maplewood as a place where people kept their heads down, paid their dues, and avoided Margaret's wrath. But the group 5 or 6 neighbors, ranging from a young couple to an older man with a cane, looked ready to talk. Frank lowered his voice. Margaret's been pulling this crap for years. Find me $200 for a crack in my driveway. Told Linda her mailbox was too blue. It's time someone stopped her. I hesitated. I'm pushing a lawsuit, but it's not just about me. They destroyed my kid's playground. What's next? Someone's garden? Their fence? Exactly, Linda said. We're starting a petition to force a special election, maybe dissolve the HOA entirely. You in? It was a spark, the kind that could ignite something bigger. I agreed to join them, and by the end of the night, we'd formed a loose committee. Frank offered his garage for meetings, and Linda started drafting a petition to demand transparency and new leadership. For the first time since moving to Maplewood, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. The next morning, Carl called me back to the sheriff's office. When I arrived, he was waiting in a small conference room, a thick folder on the table. You're going to want to see this, he said, sliding it toward me. Inside were scanned documents, purchase orders, invoices, and a contract for the bulldozer rental, all stamped with the HOA's letterhead. But something was off. The signatures Margaret's supposedly varied wildly. Some were sharp and precise, others loopy and rushed. The contract's date didn't match Mike Russo's work log. Look at this, Carl said, pointing to the rental invoice. The equipment came from a company in Butler County. Their manager says the authorization form was faxed in with a fake notary stamp. Margaret never showed ID, never appeared in person. Payment came from a personal checking account, not the HOA's. I stared at the page. She paid for it herself? Seems like it. But she used the HOA's tax ID on the invoice. That's fraud, David, and misuse of a corporate entity. My pulse quickened. This was bigger than I'd imagined. Margaret wasn't just reckless, she was calculated, covering her tracks with forged documents. Carl pulled another file from a cabinet. There's more. We talked to a former HOA treasurer, Robert Klein. He quit 2 years ago, said Margaret pressured him to fudge budget reports and blocked him from seeing bank statements. When he pushed back, she threatened to report him for incompetence to the state. But HOAs don't have state licensing, I said, frowning. Exactly. She made it up to scare him off. Robert gave us a USB drive with old meeting minutes, including a recording. Carl opened his laptop and hit play. Margaret's voice filled the room, cold and commanding. They won't fight back. They never do. We find them, they pay. We call it a violation, they repaint their doors. If someone causes trouble, we make their life unbearable. Another voice, hesitant, chimed in. What if they get a lawyer? We drown them in fees, Margaret replied. We've got the reserve fund. They don't. I felt a chill. This wasn't just about my playground, it was a system, a machine designed to control and intimidate. Carl shut the laptop. We've sent this to the DA. They're opening a case for abuse of fiduciary duty and conspiracy. Margaret's in deep. That afternoon, I met Frank and Linda at City Hall. We'd collected over 100 signatures for the petition to force a special election, enough to meet the city's threshold. The clerk, a brisk woman in her 60s, stamped our forms and promised a vote within 60 days. As we left, Frank clapped me on the shoulder. My brother-in-law's in lending, he said. Told me Margaret tried refinancing her house last week. Your lien blocked it. I didn't smile, but I felt a flicker of satisfaction. She's starting to feel it. She's unraveling, Linda added. Someone saw her yelling at a landscaper over a weed notice her own notice. Back home, Ellen called with more news. The HOA's insurance company reached out. They're offering to settle, full damages, legal fees, and a letter admitting the board acted outside its authority. But there's a catch: if we settle, we can't pursue the liens. I leaned back, thinking of Tommy's face when he saw the wreckage. Decline it, I said. Let's keep the pressure on. 3 days later, a state auditor showed up at the HOA's clubhouse. Someone nobody knew who had tipped off the state's Housing Oversight Board. The audit uncovered a financial mess. $25,000 in administrative expenses with no receipts, payments to non-existent vendors, and a landscaping contract funneled through a shell company linked to a board member's relative. The findings spread through Maplewood like wildfire, posted on the community forum alongside stories of other HOA abuses: of fence repainted without consent, fines for a bird feeder that broke no rules. The neighborhood was waking up, and Margaret's empire was crumbling. The air in Maplewood Estates carried a new energy, like the neighborhood had shaken off a heavy fog. For years, residents had lived under the shadow of Margaret Hensley's HOA, swallowing fines for minor infractions and keeping their heads down to avoid her wrath. But the audit's findings: $25,000 in unaccounted funds, fake vendors, and a shell company lit a fuse. The community forum, usually a quiet corner of the internet for lost pet notices and garage sale ads, exploded with stories. One man posted photos of his garage door, repainted by HOA contractors without his permission because it was too faded. A woman shared how she'd been fined $150 for a bird bath that clashed with the aesthetic. The anger wasn't just about money, it was about years of control, of neighbors feeling like prisoners in their own homes. I wasn't leading the charge, but I was part of it. The petition for a special election had gained traction, and our committee, Frank Miller, Linda Carter, and a dozen others, met twice a week in Frank's garage, surrounded by tool racks and the faint smell of motor oil. We pored over HOA bylaws, dug through old meeting minutes, and discovered the board hadn't held a properly noticed election in 4 years. Margaret had ruled like a queen, hand-picking loyalists to rubber stamp her decisions. We weren't just fighting for my playground anymore. We were fighting for Maplewood's soul. One humid Tuesday morning, Deputy Carl Thompson called me to the sheriff's office again. Got something you need to see, he said, his tone serious but with a hint of excitement. When I arrived, he was in the same small conference room, a cardboard envelope on the table. The word evidence was scrawled across it in bold marker. Found this wedged in the station's drop box, he said. No name, no return address. I opened it carefully. Inside were 12 pages of printed emails from the HOA's internal mailing list, and they were dynamite. Margaret had instructed board members to delete records, backdate minutes, and fabricate votes for expenses already flagged in the audit. One email, sent 3 days after the bulldozer tore through my yard, read, "If anyone asks, we had a signed complaint from the Harper family's neighbor. I'll handle the rest." No mention of the equipment rental in writing. It wasn't just fraud, it was a cover-up, deliberate and cold. Who sent this? I asked, my hands tightening around the pages. Carl shrugged. Could be a board member trying to save their skin. Maybe someone who's had enough of Margaret. Either way, this is gold for the DA. He slid the envelope into an evidence bag. County prosecutors are already building a case: conspiracy, fraud, obstruction. These emails blow her defense wide open. I drove home, my mind racing. Margaret wasn't just a bully. She was a criminal, pulling strings to protect herself while intimidating everyone else. The emails confirmed what I'd suspected. She'd targeted my playground to send a message, to show the neighborhood what happened when you crossed her. But she'd underestimated me, and now, the whole community. That afternoon, Ellen Clarkson called with another bombshell. The state's Housing Oversight Board just suspended the HOA's authority, she said. They failed to file financial disclosures for 3 years straight. That's a violation of state law, and it triggered an automatic freeze on their operations. No fines, no enforcement, no nothing until the criminal case wraps up. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. What about the civil suit? We're still pushing forward. The insurance company's sweating. They know they're on the hook for damages if Margaret's actions are deemed outside HOA authority. They're hinting at a bigger settlement, but I say we hold firm. The liens are still active, and they're feeling the squeeze. The liens. Margaret's house, with its pristine lawn and tacky fountain, was now untouchable by lenders thanks to my notice of intent. So were the properties of 3 other board members: Tom Grayson, a realtor with a fake smile, Susan Wells, a retired accountant who nodded at every word Margaret said, and Greg Palmer, a car dealership owner who treated the HOA like his personal fan club. They'd all backed Margaret's bulldozer stunt, and now their assets were in limbo. By Friday, the neighborhood was buzzing. Frank organized a backyard barbecue at his place, and over 40 people showed up, more than I'd ever seen at any HOA event. The mood was electric, a mix of relief and defiance. Linda handed me a cold beer as we stood near a folding table piled with burgers and potato salad. "This is because of you, David," she said. "You stood up, and now everyone's waking up." I shook my head. "It's not just me. It's all of us." Frank raised his voice, drawing the crowd's attention. "To David Harper, the guy who took on the HOA and didn't blink." The applause was loud, genuine, and for a moment, I felt like I belonged in Maplewood in a way I never had before. We spent the night planning. More signatures for the petition, a push for a transparent election, and a campaign to rewrite the HOA bylaws to prevent another Margaret. Someone even suggested dissolving the HOA entirely, sparking a heated debate. Was an HOA necessary, or was it just a tool for control? The question hung in the air, unanswered but alive. The next week, Carl dropped another bombshell. "We interviewed a former board member, Nancy Holt," he said over the phone. "She quit last year after Margaret tried to strong-arm her into signing off on a $10,000 consulting fee to a company that didn't exist. Nancy kept records, bank transfers, emails, even a voicemail where Margaret threatened to ruin her reputation if she talked." I whistled. "That's conspiracy, isn't it?" And then some. The DA's forensic IT team is pulling deleted emails from the HOA's server. They've already found a trail leading to Margaret's personal accounts. She wasn't just skimming, she was funneling money through fake invoices. The evidence was piling up, and so was the community's momentum. At our next committee meeting, Linda shared a discovery. The HOA's reserve fund, meant for community upkeep, had been drained by nearly $40,000 over 2 years. Payments went to vendors with no addresses, no tax records, and in one case, a P.O. box registered to Margaret's cousin. The community forum lit up again, with residents demanding answers. One woman posted about being fined $300 for a porch light that was too bright, only to learn the fine went straight to an untraceable account. The outrage was palpable, and it was spreading. On Wednesday, I got a call from the Department of Insurance. They'd been investigating the HOA's coverage after a tip, likely from someone in our committee. The report was damning. Margaret had let the HOA's insurance lapse a year ago, forging renewal documents to hide it. Homeowners had paid thousands in dues for coverage that didn't exist. If someone had been injured on common property, a park, a sidewalk, the clubhouse, there'd have been no protection, no liability coverage, nothing. It was reckless, bordering on criminal negligence. I sent the insurance report to Ellen, along with the bulldozer footage, the fake fine notice, and the anonymous envelope of emails. "This is our leverage," she said. "The DA's office is moving fast now. They're talking felony charges, wire fraud, obstruction, operating a nonprofit under false pretenses. Margaret's not just losing her position, she's looking at prison." By the end of the week, the special election was set. The city clerk confirmed we'd exceeded the signature threshold, and notices went out to every household in Maplewood. The vote would replace the entire board and decide the HOA's fate. Frank, Linda, and I went door to door, talking to neighbors who'd been silent for years. Some were skeptical, worried about retaliation, but most were ready to fight. A retired teacher named Clara told me she'd been fined for planting tulips that weren't approved. A young dad, Miguel, shared how the HOA had threatened to tow his car during a snowstorm because it was parked on the street. The stories were endless, and they all pointed back to Margaret. As the election neared, Margaret's grip on Maplewood slipped. Her house, once a symbol of her authority, had a for sale sign out front, but no buyers. The lien had frozen her refinancing plans, and whispers spread that she was arguing with contractors over her own lawn. The woman who'd ruled with an iron clipboard was unraveling, and the neighborhood was watching. The weeks leading up to the special election in Maplewood Estates were a whirlwind. The neighborhood had transformed from a place of quiet compliance to a hotbed of defiance. Our committee, now a tight-knit group of neighbors led by Frank Miller and Linda Carter, held meetings at the public library, live streaming them on a community Facebook page to ensure transparency. The turnout was staggering. Over 60 residents packed the room at the first session, folding chairs spilling into the aisles. People who'd never spoken up before were sharing stories of Margaret Hensley's tyranny. Fines for unapproved flower beds, threats over holiday decorations, even a $400 penalty for a basketball hoop deemed unsightly. The anger was raw, but so was the hope. We weren't just fighting Margaret anymore. We were rebuilding Maplewood. The civil lawsuit against the HOA was gaining steam. Ellen Clarkson, my lawyer, had filed motions to expand the case, adding charges of abuse of fiduciary duty based on the state audit's findings. The liens on Margaret's house and the properties of board members Tom Grayson, Susan Wells, and Greg Palmer were now public record, and the pressure was showing. Greg's car dealership had a going out of business sign, and Susan had stopped attending HOA meetings altogether. Margaret, though, clung to her defiance, spotted at the clubhouse scribbling notes as if she could still control the narrative. Then came the criminal case. Deputy Carl Thompson called me one crisp October morning with news that felt like a thunderclap. The DA's office has indicted Margaret on 7 felony counts, he said. Conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of property, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, operating a nonprofit under false pretenses, criminal mischief, and trespass. Tom and Susan got hit with accessory to fraud and tampering with public records. They're being arraigned next week. I sat down hard on my kitchen chair. Prison time? If convicted, Margaret's looking at 4 to 7 years, plus probation. The others might get lighter sentences if they cooperate, but the DA's not offering plea deals without full restitution and public admissions of guilt. The indictment sent shockwaves through Maplewood. The community forum exploded with reactions, some neighbors cheering, others worried about the fallout. One post asked, "Is this justice, or are we tearing our neighborhood apart?" It was a question that lingered in my mind. I wanted Margaret held accountable, but I also wanted Maplewood to heal. Was I pushing too far, or was this the only way to stop her? The special election was scheduled for the following week, but the criminal trial came first. Margaret's court date was set for a Monday, and I was called to testify. The courthouse, a gray stone building in downtown Dayton, felt imposing as I walked in, my folder of evidence tucked under my arm. Ellen met me in the lobby, her briefcase stuffed with documents. "This is it, David," she said. "The emails, the audit, the bulldozer operator's statement theory, all admissible. Margaret's got nowhere to hide." The courtroom was packed, not just with reporters but with Maplewood residents. Frank and Linda sat in the back, along with Clara, the retired teacher, and Miguel, the young dad. Their presence steadied me. Margaret sat at the defense table, her dark blazer crisp, but her face pale, clutching a file folder like it could shield her from the truth. Her public defender, a hairy-looking man in his 30s, shuffled papers nervously. The prosecution opened with the anonymous emails from the HOA's internal list, projected on a screen for the jury. One line stood out. No mention of the equipment rental in writing. Margaret's signature was at the bottom, undeniable. The bulldozer operator, Mike Russo, took the stand next, his voice steady as he pointed at her. "She told me the homeowner was out of town and the playground was condemned. I never saw a court order. I trusted her." The former treasurer, Robert Klein, was next. He detailed how Margaret had pressured him to sign off on fake invoices, threatening to ruin his reputation when he refused. "She told me I'd never work in finance again," he said, his voice shaking. "I quit to get away from her." I testified on the third day. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair, asked me to describe the playground and its destruction. I kept my voice steady, but the memories hit hard. "It was my son Tommy's birthday gift," I said. "I built it myself, every board, every nail. He's 8 years old, and he watched it get crushed like it was nothing. This wasn't just about a structure. It was about power, about Margaret using her position to control and intimidate." I looked at the jury, ordinary people like my neighbors, and added, "For years, Maplewood residents have lived in fear of fines, threats, even retaliation. This wasn't an accident. It was a message: obey or lose what you love. Margaret never took the stand. Her lawyer rested without calling a witness, a move that drew murmurs from the gallery. The prosecution closed with a forensic accountant who traced $40,000 in HOA funds to accounts linked to Margaret's relatives. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreperson read the verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted gasps, whispers, even a muffled cheer. Margaret sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Ms. Hensley, you weaponized a position of trust for personal gain. You manipulated, defrauded, and endangered an entire community. That ends today." She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, 5 years of probation, and ordered to pay full restitution plus fines. Tom and Susan, who'd cooperated with the investigation, were barred from fiduciary roles for life and faced community service. As I left the courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt vindicated, but also weary. The fight had taken months, and while Margaret was gone, the scars remained. Tommy still flinched when he heard heavy machinery, and the neighborhood was grappling with what came next. But there was hope, too. The special election was days away, and Maplewood was ready to take control. The election turnout was historic. Over 80% of residents voted, the highest in Maplewood's history. Every board member was ousted, replaced by a new team: Linda as president, Frank as treasurer, and 3 others who'd lived under Margaret's thumb and wanted change. Their first act was to suspend all HOA enforcement pending a legal review. No more fines, no more threats. The community cheered, not loudly, but with a quiet resolve. A week later, I got a call from Ellen. "The HOA's insurance company settled," she said. "Full damages $18, 500 plus legal fees, and a public apology admitting the board's actions were unauthorized. You won't need the liens anymore." I exhaled. What about the community? They're auditing every HOA record going back 5 years. The state's involved now, ensuring it never happens again. That evening, I took Tommy to a park across town, one with a lake and a row of swings that creaked just right. He raced ahead, climbing a slide with a grin I hadn't seen in months. I sat on a bench, watching him, and for the first time in forever, I wasn't bracing for the next fight. The silence was peaceful, not tense. But the story wasn't over. A few days later, a neighbor slipped a note under my door. "Check the community forum." I logged on and found a new post-to-scan letter from the state attorney general's office. Margaret had been funneling HOA funds into a personal account for years, not just for the bulldozer, but for fake consulting contracts and inflated maintenance fees. The total? Over $60,000. The attorney general was pursuing additional charges, and Maplewood was now a case study in HOA reform. The neighborhood was changing. Volunteers took over common area maintenance, organizing work parties through group chats. One guy painted his house a bold navy blue, something Margaret would have fined him for. Instead, he got compliments. Clara planted her tulips again, and Miguel parked his car wherever he damn well pleased. Maplewood was becoming a community, not a dictatorship. The weeks after the special election felt like Maplewood Estates had taken its first deep breath in years. The new HOA board Linda Carter as president, Frank Miller as treasurer, and a trio of neighbors who'd endured Margaret Hensley's reign moved quickly to restore trust. Their meetings, held in the public library with a live stream for anyone to watch, were a stark contrast to the secretive gatherings of the old regime. Residents packed the room, not out of fear, but out of a shared determination to rebuild. The board's first major decision was to rewrite the HOA bylaws, stripping away the draconian rules that had let Margaret fine people for bird baths or porch lights. They also launched a full financial audit, promising to recover every cent of the $60,000 Margaret had siphoned off through fake invoices and shell companies. I didn't run for the board. My fight had been personal. Tommy's playground, our home, our right to live without fear. But standing in the library during that first meeting, watching neighbors debate bylaws with passion instead of resignation, I felt something I hadn't in years: pride in Maplewood. The community wasn't just healing, it was thriving. People waved from their driveways, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. Lawns stayed neat, not because of fines, but because neighbors helped each other out, trading tools and tips over coffee. One sunny Saturday, I decided it was time to rebuild Tommy's playground. The insurance settlement $18, 500+ legal fees had come through, and I'd been planning something bigger, better, something that would make Tommy's eyes light up again. I spent a week at the hardware store, picking out sturdy cedar beams, a climbing net, and a double racing slide. Frank and Miguel showed up unannounced to help, bringing a toolbox and a cooler of soda. Linda dropped by with her teenage son, who turned out to be a whiz with a drill. By Sunday, the new playground stood tall in my backyard, a lookout tower, a rope bridge, and a sandbox twice the size of the old one. Tommy climbed to the top, his sneakers thumping against the wood, and let out a whoop as he slid down the slide. "You think they'll knock this one down too, Dad?" he asked, his voice half teasing but carrying a trace of worry. I shook my head, ruffling his hair. "Not a chance, buddy. This one's here to stay." As he ran back to the slide, I glanced toward the street. Margaret's Colonial, with its gaudy fountain and wilting rose bushes, still had a for sale sign out front. It had been there for a month, untouched by buyers. The lien I'd placed had scared off lenders, and word around Maplewood was that Margaret was struggling to cover her legal fees. Her empire had crumbled, and while I didn't revel in her downfall, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing she'd face the consequences of her actions. The final piece of the puzzle arrived on a chilly November morning. Deputy Carl Thompson called me to the sheriff's office one last time. "We've got closure on the criminal case," he said as I sat across from him in the familiar conference room. He slid a folder across the table, thicker than the last. The state attorney general's office wrapped up their investigation. Margaret's been ordered to pay full restitution $60,000 to the HOA, plus $20,000 in fines. They also found evidence of additional fraud. She'd been skimming dues to pay for personal expenses, like a vacation to Florida and a new HVAC system for her house. I flipped through the folder, my eyes catching on a bank statement showing transfers to an account in her cousin's name. What happens now? She's serving her 4-year sentence, no early release unless she pays restitution in full. The other board members, Tom and Susan, took plea deal community service and a lifetime ban from fiduciary roles. Greg Palmer's dealership went bankrupt, and he's moved out of state. The Attorney General's using Maplewood as a case study for HOA reform across Ohio. Carl leaned back, a rare smile breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. "You did more than get your playground back, David. You exposed a system that's been hurting people for years. That's something." I drove home, the folder on the passenger seat, feeling a weight lift. The fight had been exhausting months of legal battles, late-night meetings, and the constant ache of seeing Tommy's disappointment. But it was worth it. Not for revenge, but for the quiet, steady return of something we'd all nearly forgotten, control over our own lives. That evening, I found a package wedged between my screen door and handle. No name, no return address, just a plain manila envelope. Inside were more HOA emails, printed and annotated with a highlighter. They detailed Margaret's attempts to shred documents after the bulldozer incident, including a panicked message to Susan, "Delete everything from the last 2 years. If they find the vendor contracts, we're done." Whoever sent it, maybe a remorseful board member or a whistleblower neighbor, had given us the final nail in Margaret's coffin. I forwarded copies to Carl and Ellen, who confirmed the emails would be used in an ongoing probe to ensure no other board members were hiding misconduct. By spring, Maplewood had changed in ways I hadn't imagined. The new board, led by Linda, had slashed HOA dues by 30%, redirecting funds to community projects like a renovated park and a free summer camp for kids. Volunteers took over landscaping, turning the clubhouse's overgrown flower beds into a community garden. Clara's tulips bloomed brightly, and Miguel's car stayed parked on the street without a single fine. One neighbor, a retired artist named Helen, painted her fence a vibrant purple, and instead of complaints, she got a dozen thank you notes for adding character to Maplewood. I took Tommy to the new park one afternoon, watching him swing across monkey bars while I sat on a bench with a thermos of coffee. Frank walked by, pushing a wheelbarrow full of mulch for the community garden. He nodded as he passed. "We did good, David." "We did right," I said, and he smiled, knowing exactly what I meant. The victory wasn't loud or flashy. It was in the small things: neighbors talking over fences, kids playing without fear of arbitrary rules, a community that felt like a home again. Margaret's house sold eventually, to a young family who painted it a soft yellow and let their kids draw chalk murals on the driveway. The fountain was gone, replaced by a simple bird bath. Life moved on, but Maplewood carried the scars and the strength off its rebellion. Looking back, the fight wasn't just about a playground. It was about standing up to a bully who hid behind rules and power, about a community finding its voice, and about a father showing his son that some things are worth fighting for. Tommy's new playground stood as a symbol of that, its tower gleaming in the sun, a reminder that we'd taken back our right to live freely. As I write this, Maplewood Estates is a different place. The HOA still exists, but it's a shadow of its former self, focused on supporting residents rather than controlling them. The state's HOA reform laws, inspired in part by our case, have made it harder for boards to abuse their power. And Tommy? He's back to being a kid, racing down his slide without a care, his laughter louder than any bulldozer. But the questions linger, and they're worth asking. Was our fight justice, or did it tip into vengeance? Should we have settled early to avoid tearing the neighborhood apart, or was exposing Margaret's crimes the only way to heal? And what about the bigger picture? How do we stop bullies, whether they're HOA presidents or something else, without becoming what we fight against? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you faced a bully like Margaret, in an HOA or elsewhere? How far would you go to stand up to injustice, and where's the line between right and revenge? Share your stories, take a stand, and let's keep this conversation going. Maplewood learned that silence lets tyrants thrive. Don't let that happen where you are.